Hey, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. We're going to have an interesting journey, and I hope you have an interesting journey. Um, because the principle is true. It's the divine principle is absolutely true. This is how the universe is built. And once you understand it's really true, but the principle of creation is very short and it's not it doesn't hash out the details. For example, it says there should be give and take action for energy to be created. So for example, in a couple relationship, that means couples should talk and about their issues, and that allow energy to be created. But talking about issues is a complex topic which involves listening and speaking properly and all kinds of issues. But the principle doesn't go into that. It just says do this and energy will be created. So we've got to look deeper into what's underneath the surface of the principle of creation. And then you can start to see how you are built and how your marriage can be built using the principle of creation. Okay, so we're going to go through like 5 different sections, and then we'll have a short, discussion. There isn't a lot of time for discussion, but hopefully we'll get through this. Okay. So let's start. Okay, so this is how we're going to explain how the principle of creation manifests itself into the world of marriage education. In other words, the marriage education specialists don't know they're talking about the principle, but they are. Because the principle is exactly how the universe is created. Therefore, and since people, and it's about how the ideal world is created. And if you want to create an ideal family, then you've got to use the principles in the principle of creation to build that ideal family. So the marriage educationists are all talking about the principle, and so are business people exactly the same thing. So we're going to be looking at how the divine principle can be interpreted. It's a story it gives, one of the many stories it creates, which allows you to understand marriage education and how you can channel the principle better in your life and hopefully use it to build a better family too. Okay, so here we are. We have this simple diagram in the principle. It's called the first blessing, and it says we have a mind and body, and through that unity between our mind and body, when mind is centered upon God, when we are God's children, when we act as a temple of God, and we drag our body in that direction, then we become competent people. So the question fundamentally is, what qualities allow a person to become fruitful? What is it, the internal world? What can go on there which allows some people to be successful and with their lives and build good marriages? And so we've got to uncover those different areas. So let's just start with the basics of the areas that marriage education covers from a principled viewpoint. So here we have the principle starts with this kind of paradigm. Yeah, we are divided human beings. We have a good part, a healthy part of ourselves, which tends towards goodness and can create goodness, and we can do all kinds of good things like cook meals or hug our wife or husband or learn something. Or there's all kinds of goodness which we can manifest. So we've got that part. But the principle also says all human beings are born with original sin. We have a tendency which heads towards evil, and sometimes in our marriage that comes out as a traumatized response to a situation. It's an unhealthy response where God can't dwell, and so we have this problem, and it's been a historic problem. Where, shall I get revenge on my spouse, or shall I, shall I forgive them or not forgive them? Shall I get back at them, etc., etc.? Do I hit them? Is that the only way to control them? All kinds of things go on. So we're divided human beings, and that's because of the fall of man. That's our situation. So if we look at ourselves in marriage, we all enter marriage with some strengths, some things we can do quite well. We're reasonably competent. That's why the person married us in the first place, hopefully. Oh, you've got some good points there. But we also have some weaknesses, and of course, marriage is all about growth. It's a growth vocation. It's a how can I grow to become a child of God? It's built for that purpose so that I can develop myself into the so I can manifest the four realms of heart, which is this ability to bring blessings down into my family. So so therefore, because I can grow, I have the ability to grow and to co-create myself. And there's certain principles which we use to grow ourselves and develop ourselves, but it is a lifelong learning process. But of course, on the other side, there's the fallen part of ourselves, the part that manifests trauma. And so we have this traumatized part of ourselves, yeah, which manifests itself in our marriages, in drinking problems or drug addictions, various addictions, or violence, or whatever else it is. It's constant criticism or whatever. But it's a traumatization of the original mind, so we end up with collective trauma as human beings. In other words, our society contains trauma and we inherit that. There's inherited trauma which comes down our family tree, and we sometimes inherit that. And we've got personal trauma because something happened to us and we couldn't navigate that emotionally, and we buried it, and we buried those powerful emotions, and they stored there, and they keep coming up and harming our lives. And that leads us to collective and inherited and personal sin. So this is kind of like this is the world of marriage education. Sometimes you can have a look at these traumas. So sorry, I have to make people. Okay. So this is a basic rule in marriage ed. We naturally develop our weaknesses into strengths through the principles of co-creation, which I'll talk about later. However, if there is a block to stop growth, this is usually due to a hidden trauma. And so in other words, if I sit down and we try and discuss finances and it just turns into an argument every time, this is probably based on some kind of trauma like fear and things like this, and that it just gets stimulated and it invades the problem. Or you try and get romantic and your partner's always going like cold and doesn't want to respond. Again, there's trauma. So we basically, if a person can grow naturally, like, oh, can you learn to pick up your socks, and can you learn to say hello nicely to me in the morning, and you can do that, then that's perfect, that's wonderful. But sometimes we get blocked and we can't do that, and we have to resolve the trauma before we can move forward. But there is a third component, and although the principle doesn't actually say this, it is embedded within the principle, and we'll talk about this later. There's the principles by which we achieve our goals. So here we have a marital goal. We have a marital goal, and it's a goal, and because it's a goal, it's governed by can I manifest the principles that allow me to achieve my goals. Now, why is this a different dimension than the healthy self and the traumatized self? It's because the principles is like managing your goals is like common sense, and you can't traumatize common sense. You can't traumatize that. You can misuse them. Your traumatized self can misuse common sense, but you can't traumatize common sense. Common sense is common sense, and you either use these principles to build a good marriage, or you don't use them, and that's really your choice. Okay. So when I studied marriage education, I started reading it like 2004. There were different waves of marriage education. The first wave looked at the principles by which we achieve our goals. So, for example, there was Mars and Venus, and that was like dual characteristics, and like trying to say you need to understand the difference between men and women, and then you can function better. And it's one of those principles. You just have to understand the differences of the people involved in your goal setting task. And so that was a major influence, but they realized it only helped certain types of people, and they had to go more deeper, and they had to look in the internal world of people And the second wave of marriage education looked at, like, how do we work internally and how can you manage your internal life? So that kind of area. And then, of course, we came to the point where realizing, gosh, people have trauma, and there became a third wave of marriage education, which developed. You can't do much, but you can do something. Like you can have. We'll talk about this later. But so this is how marriage education, because they are trying to understand how the ideal works, they obviously get to the point where they explain the principle.